All right, I'll ask Lois to begin the introduction.
Well, welcome to our Atlantis series. Why are we studying Atlantis? I think there are two really good reasons. One is Atlantis is a cautionary tale. So it's really good to be watching that now. And I think a lot of you will understand that we are in a period where a cautionary tale is a good thing to watch. And also, to expand consciousness, an important aspect is to expand our awareness of spiritual history of the past and spiritual future planning as we go forward. And Steiner was providing us with both. So looking at Atlantis is both an expansion of consciousness, and it is a tale that we have to look at right now as we're coming back around, and you'll see in our presentations how we're kind of coming back around to something we were doing then. Grant.
As Lois said, we have 3 nights, and we're going to cover the beginning to the end of Atlantis each night, but from a different perspective. So this evening, we're going to begin talking about more of the physical, what the appearance was, what the locations were, what the interaction with the rest of the world was. It's quite a physical presentation, and this is not what Steiner has offered us. So Lois will introduce in a moment where this source of information comes from. Then we will also cover the lead up to Atlantis. Where does Atlantis fit in the long history of humanity? And that will be quite directly from Steiner's cosmic memory lectures. So I'll do that part. Next week, we cover the developmental stages, consciousness, culture, the technologies, the mystery centers. And the final week, the socio-political development. What did groups of Atlanteans do with and to each other over the history of Atlantis? How did the higher beings interact with them? That will happen each week, but certainly at the end. And then some modern day reflections on why Atlantis still matters. So that's the layout for the 3 weeks. Lois and I are in the same room. So if the echo gets really bad, or if the delay gets really bad, somebody raise their hand and let us know. Otherwise, I'm happy to pass it back to Lois.
Okay, where is our information coming from? We're also recording these sessions so that they'll be available online, and anticipating that people who don't know anthroposophy will be looking in. I think looking around the audience here live, this is probably old news, but I'll run through it very quickly. Where does the information on Atlantis that we are presenting here come from? It comes from reading the Akashic record. This does not come from any historical documents like Plato and tablets, Sumerian tablets that were interpreted by someone. And these are actual readings in the Akashic record. And what does that mean? Each person that we're talking about, that we're presenting from, was very careful to start their presentation with how they got the information. And what they are saying is that to read the Akashic record, you have to develop your spiritual capacities, and that every human being has the possibility in our age of doing that. Just like everyone can learn to play the guitar, everyone can learn to do basketball. Doesn't mean you're really good at it, but with practice, you can always get better. And these spiritual capacities are allowing the Rudolf Steiner and I thought it was W. Scott-Elliot, but I've been doing a lot of research around the presentation, and I actually even went to Wikipedia, and it wasn't W. Scott-Elliot who was reading in the Akashic record. It was Ledbetter. Now, anthroposophists know Ledbetter as the partner of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky when they began the Theosophical Society. It was Ledbetter who was reading in the Akashic Chronicle, and it was W. Scott-Elliot who was doing the research as to how that fit together with maps and research of that kind, with physical research. So both, and the introduction to W. Scott-Elliot's work is given by J.P. Sinnett. Anthroposophists will know J.P. Sinnett because he wrote, I always want to call it occult Buddhism, but it's not. It's, what's the other word for occult? Esoteric Buddhism, which is quite a well-known text. And also he misquoted the eighth sphere in that text. So Steiner brought him to our attention through that. But J.P. Sinnett, who introduced Ledbetter and W. Scott-Elliot and got this report on Atlantis going, is very careful to introduce that this information is from reading in the astral light. And he has a wonderful way of introducing it. He says, even when we remember anything, we're actually remembering in a recording, not in our brain. We are remembering in the astral light. And most people remember only what they themselves contribute to the printing. But an occultist can see behind and through objects to what was printed in distant past. Steiner, too, very carefully indicates that this is a report using spiritual capabilities, and he points out that anyone can develop them by working with his book, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. So if you aren't familiar with anthroposophy, Google Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, and that is one of the places that gives step-by-step instructions in how to open your ability to go into the spiritual world and move into the past and read this material. So very carefully set out, this is not historical documentation. This is reading the Akashic record, and both men are very careful also to say anyone with this capability reading in the Akashic record is seeing the exact same thing. So this is objective spiritual information. Are we ready to look at the maps?
No, not at all. Let me position Atlantis.
Oh, yes, you have to do that first.
All right, happy to take the baton. Anyone who's new to anthroposophy may not know that it is our practice to divide things into 7, especially planetary things, like the development of our solar system. So if we divide the development of our solar system from the beginning to the future end, when the solar system may end in a red dwarf or a nova, that whole period of time divided by 7, each of those 7 sections have been given a name. And Atlantis is the middle section, the fourth. So I want to very quickly describe the first and the second, and then a little bit of detail on the third. The first section of the history of the solar system is what we could call the dust cloud. Before any planets had formed, before the sun had coalesced, just a collection of material, undifferentiated. Now, anthroposophy doesn't accept the simple description of dust, but the imagination is good enough. An undifferentiated cloud. Well, that went for several billion years, perhaps, but astronomy is not clear on that. So we'll just say it went for a period of time, and then the central sun began to accrete to itself and form, to coalesce. At that point, astronomers would agree, we have a solar system. There's a sun. The first period before that is called in anthroposophy and theosophy the Polarian period, or Polaris. We lived in Polaris. So Steiner tells us that even that far back, there was a connection to the history of humanity. And in fact, not a topic for tonight, even farther back than that. But let's start at the creation of our solar system. The Polaris great epoch is when no planetary bodies, including the sun, had formed. The second great epoch, named Hyperborea, and sometimes that's picked up in sci-fi and fantasy, and lots of big muscled men fight big animals and beautiful women hang on their arms. Nothing like that in the anthroposophical picture of Hyperborea. That's the period when the sun has formed and the planets are beginning to form. So now we have, by the end of Hyperborea, a planet that we can call Earth. And so at the end of Hyperborea, we have many of the planets in our solar system already formed and at a distance from the sun. Anthroposophy suggests to us that it's not quite the picture that we have today, where there are regular orbits and everything is quite clockwork mechanics, but we have the planets in existence. And so we can focus on the planet that we are doing our development on. And that's the planet we can call Earth. I say we can call Earth because I'll go to the third epoch, the third great epoch. And that's the epoch or the period of time that we name Lemuria. And in Lemuria, we have this newly formed Earth at the beginning of Lemuria. And we also have the beginning of human individual histories. So until then, we've been a group, we've been a tribe, we've been not individuals, but many instances of what will be called human. But in Lemuria, the higher beings engage with the world and our essence and endow us with individual egos. So during Lemuria, we become individual human beings. Not at all physically like we are now, which I'll go into in a moment, but individuals. So that means we have the beginning of an individual history. And of course, in anthroposophy, we take quite seriously the understanding that when we die, we will come back to another life. And when we die from that, we will spend a period of time out of the physical, and then we will come back to another physical life. That began to form a history for each of the individual humans during Lemuria. The higher beings endowed us with individual egos. And so we should incarnate into the physical world to gain experience. That's the purpose of the planets, is to offer experience. In fact, you could say offer experience in a place that resists the ease of existence that would be otherwise experienced in the spiritual world. The physical world is more difficult. We learn things due to challenges and resistances. So as individual humans, we began to incarnate into the material that was being provided for us on the physical earth. But at that time, the physical earth had just formed, and it was extremely hot. It was quite different than our earth is now. It was hot to the extent that we didn't have the division between solid and liquid and gas, that they intermingled, and the solid was not solid. It was much more molten and fluid. And the liquid was not the same as our liquid now, because it intermingled heavily with the air or the gas. And so the air was extremely filled with the liquid. We could say filled with water vapor, to the extent that you couldn't see through the air. So quite a different environment. So each of us individual humans, I say us because we all have the history from Lemurian times. Each of us incarnated or attempted to incarnate into the physical bodies that were being developed through the evolution of animals. Ultimately, we had bodies that should be suitable for humans to incarnate into, but that was not proven to be true, that very few of us were able to incarnate into these bodies, even though the solid was very molten and fluid, and the gas and liquid were quite different. These bodies were considered to be too hard to incarnate into. Only a very few of us, archetypically the Adam and Eve story, very few of us were able to incarnate into bodies on the earth during Lemurian period. And the spiritual beings that are guiding this development saw clearly that this was not functional, that if we couldn't incarnate, we couldn't get physical experience. We couldn't evolve that way. And so many of us who couldn't incarnate were taken away to the other planets for a period of time while the problem was worked on. Strange to think, we had a long period of existence. Each of us, aside from the very small group of extremely strong souls, each of us was taken aside to one of the planets, perhaps Venus, perhaps Saturn, and stayed there for quite a while the higher beings fixed the problem. And the way they fixed the problem was to segregate the material in the earth into two different groups, a group in which we could say it was purer and easier to incarnate into, and a group that removed some of the hindrance material. You could say removed the garbage. So that formed up I'll call it a very large patch on the side of the earth, and then in a centrifuge style started to be thrown off from the earth. So the type of material that was left behind was much purer, and this garbage material was thrown off from the earth, not as a scatter, but as a single blob, a single object. And that object was quite large and was moved into position and formed its own sphere, a very large sphere close to the earth, which of course we call today the moon. So the moon is how the problem of incarnating into the earth was solved. The moon took much of the difficult material out and left the more manageable, functional material on the earth. Well, that was very dramatic in many ways. Of course, it was incredibly disruptive to the world at that point, but it also had effects on the life in the world, in particular the humans, because we had been, the few of us that could incarnate, we had been incarnating into this very fluid environment as almost amoeba-like humans, like an amoeba that floats around in the water and stretches and comes together and envelops its food. And when it needs to reproduce, it just splits. Well, the original Lemurian humans were like that. But when the moon removed much of the material and some of the forces of reproduction, humans had to follow the pattern that some of the animals had already achieved of separating the sexes. So humans became, at that point, after the moon was removed, male and female. So before that, it wasn't the case that we had two different beings involved in reproduction of bodies. So now that is a successful method at this point in Lemuria, and the bodies are starting to be reproduced at a much better rate after the moon was removed. And now the bodies are being available. So some of us can begin to come back from the planets and join the very strong individual souls. And so the Earth begins to be populated by humans. But these humans are quite different physically than we are now, or we could say we were quite different physically than we are now. We were living in an extremely fluid world, as I mentioned to you. So we still had the capacity to stretch our bodies tremendously, to reach across a yard and pick up something that we wished. I say yard just to give you a physical picture. There weren't yards, but there were distances that we could stretch our body on our own willpower and connect to another part of the environment. We didn't have the mental functioning that we have now. In fact, the large majority of our time, and I'll go into this more when we talk about the evolution of consciousness in Atlantis next week. But for now, we have the consciousness which is almost entirely focused on the spiritual world. We're physically incarnated, but we have no interest or attention to the physical world. We're moving around just from instinct. And that would be a pretty dangerous environment if we were all by ourselves. So in fact, we're not. There's a tremendous amount of spiritual being help to help us get through this very childish and very vulnerable stage. Spiritual beings that no longer incarnate on the earth were incarnating during Lemuria and guiding us and protecting us. Similarly, in Lemuria, even by the end of Lemuria, we had no speech. And we had no speech because we had really no memory either. So Lemuria was a place in which one picture that Steiner gives us is a typical family or a typical tribe. The women in the tribe are responsible for the cohesion of the tribe. And one of the tools they use for that is singing. So the women would sing the tribe together like a flock of songbirds. The singing task was for the women. And if you incarnated into a male body, your task was to engage with the environment, this molten hot, almost impossible to see through environment. The man would go out and engage with this environment and would take his son with him to engage with this environment, to strengthen the tribe's ability to interact with the physical. But the consciousness is almost entirely focused on the spiritual. So you go to sleep, and that's when you wake up consciously. When you go to sleep in Lemuria, you're engaged with the excitement of the spiritual world. When you wake up, you're a dumb animal moving by instinct, and there's very little that has an impact on you. And these spiritual beings are protecting us. I almost think like a herd of cattle. It's quite a different picture than you will see unfold next week through the development of consciousness in Atlantis. And this is somewhere that I would welcome questions, because it's a picture that's so alien to what we see now. Many of you have been through this. I see the names of people that have worked with me or with others or before me on this material. So it may not be new to you, but I'm hoping my presentation gives you a picture from my perspective of what Lemuria is like. And if anybody wants to add contrast or challenge, go down to reactions and raise hand, and I welcome interruptions. Short of that, I'm going to just finish. So Lois, I don't know if anyone here's an exit, but welcome back. I'm going to just finish by saying at the beginning of Atlantis, we were still in a very fluid environment. So imagine everything that Lois will tell you as if we're floating or swimming rather than striding across solid ground. That's at the very beginning of Atlantis. So I'll turn it back to Lois now.
Can you see the map? This is, I'm going to move it over a little bit so I can see what I'm looking at. This is Rudolf Steiner's drawing of Atlantis. You recognize his little side strokes if you know his work. And these are the maps that W. Scott-Elliot and Leadbeater are giving us. This is Atlantis in its prime. This is the main time in Atlantis. This is 1 million years ago to the catastrophe of 800,000 years ago by their calculation. And you can see here that there's a black outline showing what the world is today. The first map represents the land surface of the Earth as it existed at that time period. The continent of Atlantis itself extended from a point a few degrees east of Iceland and stretched down to Rio de Janeiro in South America, embracing Texas and the Gulf of Mexico, the southern and eastern states of America, as well as remains of the still older and once widespread continent of Lemuria, which is here in green. The remains of the still older Hyperborean continent are in blue. I'm really not seeing much blue there, unless those are the dots within the green.
Good, because there was no Earth.
Well, that makes sense then, that we can't see it on the map. So here we have the entering in of the various races. We've got on this side is the first race called the Tlavatli. No, Ramoahal, sorry, the Ramoahal come in next to Lemuria, sort of over here, and he talks about here. And then we swing over to the next side for the next race, the Tlavatli, and I'll go into them in more detail later. They're coming in over here. The third group here, the Toltec, are in this sort of New Mexico and up through the Americas, the US, what is now the US. The fourth race, the Turanians, are here. Now we're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We don't have that land anymore. The fifth is up in the, what we know is the Celtic region. And the sixth is on the next map, because after this, there's the first catastrophe that takes things out. And then it begins to look like this. We've got more forming around the Americas and Europe. This catastrophe caused a great many changes in the land distribution. The great continent is now shorn of its northern regions, and its remaining portion has been still further rent. The now growing American continent is separated by a chasm from its parent continent of Atlantis. And you'll see in the stories of the American Indians and the South American natives talk of gods coming from the sea. So you can see that there is this land in between the main island and the colonies, the communities that are living outside of it. The third map shows more. This was a catastrophe after 200,000 years ago. With the exception of the rents in the continents, both of Atlantis and America, and the submergence of Egypt, it will be seen how relatively unimportant were the subsidences and upheavals at this epoch. This isn't one of the great ones. What I find very interesting here is where the Sahara Desert is, there are islands in the water. And we've seen in recent times that circular cities are being found in the Sahara Desert under the sand. The archaeologists are uncovering pyramids and circular cities in the Sahara sand. And you can see how that would happen. The final map is just before that final sinking. So the main population is in this Poseidonus, this island that Plato talks about. And we're going to see next week a map of Grant's showing the mystery centers on this central area with the influence of the different planets into Atlantis. So there are two, they talk about two main islands. I guess they're talking about this. And three, the Scandinavian island appears now as joined to the mainland. And we've got we don't have a Baltic Sea, and the Sahara Desert is on the floor of the ocean. So these are our maps. And I've just touched on the 7 subraces. Now, the names of the first 2 are what they call themselves. And I certainly wish that that the Theosophists and Steiner had told us what these races called themselves. But these are the names that are given to them based on their development into more recent times. So that we have the Ramoahals, the Tlavatli, the Toltec, the Turanians, the Semites, the Akkadians and the Mongols. You can see Semites, Akkadians, and Mongols. We've got those terms in our more recent history. Roughly, the Romoahals had to incarnate in this very soft material that Grant has been describing. The planets are condensing. The Earth is condensing. The moon is condensing. The beings too are condensing. The Lemurians, according to the Theosophists, were 15 feet tall. Now the Romoahals are reported as being around 12 feet tall. And we will see their survivors, even into this day, are very large humans. The Romoahals were dark-skinned, mahogany black. And I find that hard to imagine if they're sort of formless, but we're going to have to use a lot of imagination to picture these. I like to key our imagination with these wonderful costumes or body paintings by the these are, our primitive tribes. They were seeing obviously more in the spiritual world than the physical and decorating themselves to match what they read. So watery limbed, tall, transparent skin, no self-consciousness, animated by angelic orders, embedded in nature, and developing by seeing the life forces around them. That's what they were seeing. And they were basically living in what nature had to offer: caves, forest overhangs, and clearing a bit underneath, or combining forest overhangs with caves. The Tlavatli are coming in from the opposite side. They are around 10 feet tall. They have a bit of a sense of self now. They're sort of, I think these little gentlemen down here have a bit of a feeling for themselves, so they're decorating their bodies. They were mahogany colored, so a little bit lighter, and they built structures by controlling nature. Now we're going to go into that next week. I'm just sort of hinting that they had really a control over nature, and that's how they built their structures. They were perceiving now a sense of a form in the middle of an astral etheric sheath around things, but they're starting to see forms out of this astral etheric fog, and they perceive the gods. They see the gods. They aren't a myth to them. They are perceiving them. The next race, the Toltec, are again densifying. They're now 9 feet tall. Still, that's scraping the ceiling of my room. It's sort of hard to imagine. And they're red-skinned, more think of an American Indian. They have the capacity now of reaching into the physical world and building with the densifying, mineralizing world around them. They're building with blocks cut out of stone, hacked out of stone, although their ability to transport them in the density of the air is another thing we'll cover later. The stone is much easier to move than it is at our time. Contemporary people are arguing about how they could possibly move the stones around. Well, the stones weren't quite as dense, they weren't as heavy, and they also had power when they needed it. The air was thick. It's a whole different configuration of nature and man. They also, having a sense of self, they became selfish and warring. They saw you and me, and they saw what you had. So this starts to happen, warring tribes. The Romoahals did not commit any crime. They didn't argue, they didn't fight. They were being carried by angelic forces. Now, by the Toltec time, they are deciding their own activities, and they're fighting for territory. The Turanians, the next race, 8 feet tall. Now they're yellow skinned. The Turanians are moving east. So we have there Chinese, it's the sort of the later influence. We have a yellow skinned race, and also they're more physical. You can find skeletons with elongated heads. We'll talk more about the shape of the bodies next week, that there's a relationship between the astral and etheric bodies being very large, and they're densifying as the human beings are taking in more of the substances of the mineralizing earth into themselves. The Turanians, however, are now, they have more of a feeling of their presence and what they want, and they have no control over it. They're racing around, fulfilling their needs, fulfilling their wants, terrorizing the countryside. They have no morality to temper that, and the gods are a little further away because they're denser, and it takes coming into the Semites. They are the race that begins to think. Now the etheric head has grown smaller. The center of the head and the center of the etheric head were different. Now it's densified that the etheric head and the physical head have the same center. So these Atlanteans, we are developing at that point the ability to think and to reason and to decide that that wasn't a really good idea and we ought not to do that again. And we'll hear more again next week about forming communities and deciding you don't like the way your community is being run and gathering in groups to form a different community. So what we see there are buildings, beautiful buildings being built and communities being formed. And we have a flowering of the Atlantean race. It's the 5th subrace. And you'll know in Anthroposophy, the 5 out of the 7 is a flowering. The 6th is more of a fruiting. So the Akkadians are the fruiting of Atlantis. Their cities were beautiful. Over elaborate, perhaps, very beautiful. And the pale-skinned inhabitants were now more colored the way we are, and they are again getting smaller. And if you think too about a suit of armor of the Middle Ages in our museums, they're tiny. So I think we're getting larger again. So the Atlanteans are now like 8 feet, 7 feet tall. They're still big, but they're getting smaller and their capabilities are getting sharper as you pull yourself together. And they are developing a technology that's very exciting. I really look forward to Grant's coverage of their technology. After the Akkadians came the Mongols. The Mongols were overripe, and now they have remnants of their abilities to control nature, and they have a thinking ability. So combining those two and not having the interest of the group at heart, you have the development of black magic. It started earlier, but it is really strong now. So you have white magicians, black magicians, and then the general population. And during the Mongolian period, this last 7th epoch of Atlantis, the black magicians, the manipulators of human beings for their own benefit, are getting the upper hand. And that's where we're going to see the destruction. So that is what the maps are showing us. That is what the description between Steiner and Scott-Elliot tells us about these races. We're going to go, as we said, deeper into the inner workings. This is more the outside. How big were they? What color were they? The Mongols were yellowish again, were more yellow-skinned. The Semites and Akkadians were white-skinned. And before that, they were the dark races, getting ever darker as we go backwards. Grant, over to you.
So I want to close off with some of the controversy that was raised when we ran this in a single session last weekend. There is a lecture where Steiner talks about Scott-Elliot's clairvoyant skills. And Lois has already indicated that it may not be entirely or particularly Scott-Elliot. So I think Steiner's criticism is the description, if you read it in the original source, which is Scott-Elliot's the author, 1896, I think, something like that. If you read it in the original source and you don't mix the subsequent material that Anthroposophy offers us, you get an extremely physical description, as if Atlantis had roads and forests in the air and things like that, that Steiner, I think, although he's not explicit about his criticism, would take exception to. If we can take these descriptions, as Lois has, and keep in mind that the world is very slowly becoming hardened, like we have. We can walk across the room on the floor. All of that is quite straightforward. In the early days of Atlantis, and perhaps you could argue all the way through Atlantis, the world was not as straightforwardly solid liquid gas. So these early giant humans may not even have been walking. They may have been floating or swimming through their world, because the air was so fluid and the solid was also fluid, so that the movement that a Atlantean would do, especially the oldest of the Atlanteans, would be supported by fluids that we don't experience now. So a gigantic human sounds sometimes preposterous to people who think, well, my biggest friend was 6'7" and he had hip problems. How could we have a 12-foot human? It was quite a different world then. And so the images have not been challenged by Steiner, and so we've brought them forward as Lois has. But the environment has not been described by Scott-Elliot very well. And so we're going to get into that next week, especially when we talk about technology and how technologies could arise that just aren't practical. Lois already suggested something like that by saying, how could large masses of stone be moved? So those kind of things have a logic to them if you keep the picture of the world and the environment that humans were moving through loose and flexible enough to say it wasn't like today. It was different. It gradually moved towards something we would recognize, but even at the end of Atlantis, it wasn't like today. So that's very important. In the end of Lemuria, there was a great catastrophe. I didn't mention that, but we have a bit of time. The great catastrophe was a catastrophe of heat, in which volcanism and earthquakes and tremendous disruptions to the earth were occurring. And at that point, there was a large release of heat, you could say, from the earth. And so there was a bit of a state change from Lemuria to Atlantis, where everything wasn't just, I'll put the extreme on it, wasn't just boiling lava, but there was now solid and liquid and gas. But those solids and liquids and gases, as I keep emphasizing, were not like ours today. And at the end of Atlantis, there is another disruption that will elaborate next week, in which the state of the world changed again fairly dramatically. In Lemuria, there was no real rule about how the body shape must be maintained. In Atlantis, there was, but it wasn't a fixed, firm rule. And now in our modern day, we figure that normal human beings are of a certain range of size, and that they all walked on the ground. And that's correct since Atlantis. But according to anthroposophical material, that's not correct, especially in the early parts of Atlantis. So,
Oh, also, Grant, I want to go over the photographs of what happens to the beings when who they are, who they became, what the descendants, that's the word I'm searching for. I just because it's visual and fun, and we won't be able to do this later because we're going to get so esoteric next week that this doesn't fit in. So I thought within this more outer,
excellent.
is there more
Just-
to introduce that?
Yeah, just to
Why don't
remind you,
introduce?
to remind everyone, as Lois said, the first two sub-races were given their native names because we don't have descendants that are recognized in archaeology and standard anthroposophy. Anthropology. But the next five have descendants. And so Lois is going to describe to a certain extent what we know about the how they became extant descendants. So yeah, go ahead, Lois.
Well, I love visuals. So let me get the slides open again. So these are, I love these images. This is Tierra del Fuego, and these natives are dressing themselves up, obviously, from their view into the spiritual world. Unfortunately, they no longer exist. Developers decided they wanted the island, and there's a big resort and developments there, and they did a genocide. So we don't have them anymore. In Steiner's time, he could point to pygmies and things like that. I wonder how much of that still exists. Now, it's claimed that the Laplanders are descendants of the Ramoahals. And I was talking about the large heads and the etheric head being larger than the physical head. And I love this hat with this is a typical hat of theirs. And here is a Laplander with North Americans. I'm sure they are because of their blue sneakers with white stripes on them. They've got a little Nike on their feet. So look at the size of a typical American against the size of the Laplander. They are very large. He's at least 9 feet tall, wearing blue jeans. Typical costume, but with blue jeans. I think that says a lot. The Patagonians were said to be descendants from the Tlavatli. And here's a drawing from the Europeans who were going to the New World. And look at the proportion of the bodies again. They are much larger than the Europeans. This is the ancient Peruvian culture, said to be Toltec. And you can see they have, the Toltecs were mountain people. And here they are living in the mountains in Peru. And with these formations that we'll see again when we get into the buildings that are far in advance of the cultures that are growing up around them. The Peruvians are said to be the descendants of Atlantis. Now, Egypt, I really like this. I'm going to read this. Egypt, this is from W. Scott-Elliot, who liked to research in the known world. Egypt must now be referred to in the first instance. It was the transfer of a great lodge of initiates. This took place about 400,000 years ago. The golden age of the Toltecs was long past. The first great catastrophe had taken place. The moral degradation of the people and the consequent practice of the black arts were becoming more accentuated and widely spread. Purer surroundings for the White Lodge were needed. Egypt was isolated and was thinly peopled, and therefore Egypt was chosen. The settlement so made answered its purpose, and undisturbed by adverse conditions, the Lodge of Initiates for nearly 200,000 years did its work from here. Then the time came for them to found an empire, the divine empire of Egypt, where they are teaching the people, and the colonists are being brought over. Let's see what this says from Atlantis. I think this is the Akkadians, and this is when the Pyramid of Giza was built. There's much talk these days. It's a very current topic about when the Giza pyramid, the two oldest pyramids, were actually built. And there is a lot of documentation to prove that they were earlier than the Egyptians, much earlier. And here are the Theosophists claiming, we don't know for sure, that the Atlanteans built the Pyramid of Giza. And they also say that it was to protect the Ankh, that they knew a disaster was coming, and there was a disaster before the final end, and Egypt was submerged, and the Ankh was protected in the Pyramid of Giza, according to the Theosophists. I love this image. It's a modern one of a Turanian. These are coming into our sci-fi movies and so forth, references. And so people are getting the information quite mixed up in the younger people who are developing their spiritual capacities. We are still developing, and I notice younger people are coming in with more built-in clairvoyant abilities than the what did we call ourselves? The bulk that we came in, Grant? The people born whose parents came back from the war, from the Second World War.
Or the boomers.
The boomers.
Yeah.
See, I have a Toltec memory. The new people have more clairvoyant abilities than the boomers, who had more clairvoyant abilities than the people who are frustrating Rudolf Steiner to the roots because they weren't able to take up his work. And he was pointing to 100 years later, there would be another chance. And I think really that's what we're doing now. We're spreading information that can be taken up by people because they have developed the capacity to take it in. So the Turanians are colonizing, and they're found in inland China. They're found in the Aztecs. And this is spread far and wide through the world, that people cannot understand these remnants without this central island of Atlantis, and the mythology of the people saying that the gods came from ships from the sea and taught them their culture. All makes sense when you have Atlantis in the middle and the Toltecs and Turanians going out in ships. The Semites are in Kabyle or Kabali, and you can see the white skins and the delicate features, loving the color. These are current living tribes. The Akkadians are called Sumer Akkads as their descendants, Etruscans, Phoenicians, and also the Basque people that are a curiosity to the modern world because they've retained an earlier language and they are different from anyone around them. And if you look back at the maps, you can see that that area was definitely Atlantean, late Atlantean period. The American Indians make sense when you know that there were races, root races of the Atlanteans coming up in various areas around the United States, so that some are white, some are auburn hair with blue eyes, some are very dark, some are very light. And the sub-races of Atlantis coming down through their descendants explains the variety in the American Indians. And I think the Atlantean spirituality explains a little bit of why Portland, Oregon is so strange. Portland is known as being very peculiar, and I kept seeing these tribes coming up in that area of the United States. So there we go, Portland. Now, the final Mongolian race is still, according to the Theosophists, still in development. And they say the Japanese, this is an early Japanese primitive figure and a typical, beautiful Japanese print from the last few hundred years. And they are saying the Japanese nation still has a lot of history to give the world. Here's a fun artifact. And Grant was covering that. There was a development out of fishes and walking the earth and so forth. And here in artifacts, we're finding fish with feet. And I'm going to go over these next week. These are the lovely animals of Atlantis. Do you want to do that today, or should we save that?
Well, let's stay.
How's our time?
We have a bit of time, but let's stay in our sequence.
Okay, good. We'll cover the little sweet little beasts. They make more sense too when we have the cultural ages of how they use their animals.
So we could take that image as an artistic hyperbole, or we could take it as quite realistic. The legs are so tiny that would have to be an aquatic animal to move around. So I open the field to questions. We don't want to mess up our sequence too much by grabbing things out of next week. So we can either handle questions or stop early. Up to you folks. So please unmute so you're not interrupting anyone, and speak if you wish.
Grant and Lois, thank you very much. When were the first skeletons found? When were the first skeletons found? Oh, sorry, I can't hear.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Oh, you can hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
I'll mute myself and
Okay, I'll take the question.
The first skeletons, when were they found? What subrace?
I'm making this up a bit by using my mental capacities. Very much so in the earliest, the Ramoa halls. At the most, there was cartilage. There certainly wouldn't be bone in the early Ramoa halls. And that was 1 million years ago. So we have some history of anthropomorphic skeletons and apes, and we could argue trying to integrate the sort of modern wisdom of the geological cycles and archaeology with the wisdom of anthroposophy, that some of those early skeletons were not human. Those were the developments of the animals to prepare something that could be inhabited by humans. And so in the earliest, well, certainly in the earliest Lemuria, we haven't touched the earth in any way. We're floating almost entirely non-physically at the periphery of the earth. But during Lemuria, we descend to this very molten and fluid earth. When we get into Atlantis, we are beginning to engage with up and down in a way that requires a skeleton. But to specifically say, actually, there's an excellent book that I would research that question in, the evolution of, I'm going to have to bring this back to memory now, by
Rudolf Vaxmuth.
well, Vaxmuth was a contemporary of Steiner who did that work. Now we have I believe, still living contemporary of ours who's taken that work farther. I'm sorry, it's not jumping into my head, James, but I'll bring it back next week. I'll show you the cover and I'll describe how the evolution, the paleontological picture that I studied when I was an undergrad, how that can relate to the picture that Steiner and to some extent Scott-Elliot have given us. There's been some excellent work connecting those two. I'm evading your question because I don't want to be too exact and say the first human skeleton that we inhabited is this particular race. I'm going to go back to that source, which is too heavy for me to carry. It's a lovely big book. I'll bring it in next week and I'll try to answer your question better then. Yeah.
Yes, I think there was a certain amount of, towards the end, we have to remember we're talking about the sub-races as if they're separate, but there is, it's a moving from one to another. There's always this developmental shift going on from beginning to end. So by the end of the Ramoahals, they are, if you're living in a cave, you are more substantial. So
And
there's
so
that
Lois,
mineralization of the world is gradual. And I love the way Steiner brings it, that when we are incarnating our finer bodies, our physical body is not physical in the way he talks about it, but it is a law, a field, a law, an organization that came out of the warmth of Saturn and has developed since. But we have to fill it out with substance when we get to the earth. So as the mineralization is happening of the earth itself, there are more mineral substances that are in full dilution around the Ramoahals. We have to remember that even the minerals in the beginning are in dilution, so that, but they're being pulled out and formed into plants and animals and human bodies. But the organizational capacity is spiritual, so that we have help from the spirits of form. We have heat from the archangels. So we've got all of these beings working into us. Occult science has beautiful descriptions, and you really have to squint to figure out when the delineations are, because Steiner doesn't give them that way. This is the end of, he points to the moon leaving, but he doesn't point to really a difference between Lemuria and Atlantis. He just keeps going on a continuum of the spiritual beings working in and what kind of substances they're pulling into our spiritual form. Because like we're saying, everything starts from the spirit and slowly takes in density and form. And Atlantis is a beautiful picture of that. The slow densification as the planets densify, the beings on them densify and give opportunities to elaborate the work of the whole range of hierarchies are working in and learning their lessons and graduating or not graduating based on how they're doing with forming the substance. So we really are the handiwork of the hierarchies. It's really fun to see that happening in Atlantis because now we're so hard. It's not that much difference between Middle Ages and today as far as the human body goes, except we're getting bigger. And well, no, then we've got spiritual capacities. If you look spiritually, there's a big difference. If you look physically, not so much.
So that gradual description that Lois just offered us is quite important. However, it allows us to continue to evade answering James. So I will give you a little tease. I remembered the name. The name of the author is Dankmar Bosse, Bosse. And the name of the book is The Mutual Evolution of Earth and Humanity. So I'll bring some material from that next week. Any other comments, questions? That's my style. Okay, well, if everyone's either familiar with that or happy to digest it, then we very much invite you, same time, same link, next week. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining us.